Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of Questlove Supreme. I don't know, Steve and we might need another superlative. Like, like James Brown has the famous flames. I think we should be like the legendary Supreme, or something even more exciting.
Legends. That's right.
Yeah, because I feel like every episode is yet another kind of bucket list that we didn't know that we wanted to, check off. We've now been doing this for how many years now? Is this our sixth?
Yes,
Is
sir.
this our seventh year? I don't know. I think we started
7.
Well, wait, no, 7.
Oh God, Jake is 7. Okay,
2016.
Yeah.
Wow. How many guests?
7. That's amazing.
How many guests? Hundreds. Thousands.
Yeah, I will say we rarely have double. I mean, we have a few double guests in there, but there's way too many gods to speak to. So
400, 500.
Yes, and today is no exception. Sugar Steve, you should really come. I feel like this is going to be
the time to shine, bro.
This is the Steve MVP episode. Not to put any pressure on you,
I've handled some episodes. I think I had one of the top 5 episodes of last year. If you want to check the numbers.
No, I'm just saying. Like this is sort of like we had expectations for LeBron to be the god back when in high school. And
all right, well, I want you to do your intro, but yeah, I was just telling honestly before we started the show, I was telling Bob and Sonny that I do have a radio show on WKCR, Columbia University's radio station. And the show that we do is about jazz labels. And each episode we cover a different label. And quite recently, a couple months ago, we did a 3-hour episode about Tappan Zee Records, which is Bob's label under Columbia in the late 70s and 80s and into the 90s, I believe. As part of Warner. But Tappan Zee went on for a bit, and I'm dying to talk directly to the man who started the label and who was really it was such an influential label, and it's getting a little lost. So I want to refresh our listeners with some
like the most albums. Steven said in like 20 episodes.
I know this is amazing. This is amazing. I might just skip the intro. Anyway, Fonte, Laya, you guys cool?
Yeah. We good. I'm
living the dream.
Let's have it.
What's going on, man? What's happening?
So I will basically say that our guest today, of course, is a legendary jazz musician, but I don't think we could just reduce him to jazz. His music is smooth, but we dare not call him smooth jazz. His music is hip hop, but we can't call him hip hop. But I think probably the most unique character trait of our guest today is probably our inability to pinpoint what is he exactly. Like, is he an avant-garde artist? Is he a musical provocateur? Is he the godfather of smooth jazz? I don't know. I will say that probably when the smoke clears and we start taking a toll of the artists that fall under the jazz umbrella, and there's many categories under that, I will say that as far as the scope of hip-hop, and yes, like we kind of come from a hip-hop scope because of our age and whatnot. We get to know a lot of these artists through the power of sampling. I will say that our guest is probably at the top of the list. Like, I think hands down, he's the king of textures, which is something that you don't necessarily hear someone describe another musician, but listening under a hip hop context, texture means everything. I also think that our guest is probably one of the kings of the perfect 4-bar capture, the ability to transform your new creation into something else. That's just how adventurous he is, cut to cut to cut to cut, from album to album. And I will say that probably one of the best engineered artist under the contemporary jazz umbrella. Just his sound speaks to probably everyone in my generation and beyond, because of course a lot of his music is the foundation for some of the best hip hop that I've ever known, that we've ever known. And you, the listener, you've heard his music, whether you knew it or not. He is, multi-nominated, underappreciated, loved, worshiped, always in demand, an absolute legend. I know this episode is going to be awesome. This is the Bob James episode of Questlove Supreme. Finally,
man.
Yes.
I hope that was recorded so I can put it in my memory scrapbook. Woo!
So
Wow.
can I
Good,
just
I cut it in half, like, because I couldn't really did this for 18 minutes.
Yeah, and you mentioned the best engineered. Did you mean engineered, or did you mean like him engineering it, a concept?
Well,
I mean, I'm trying to bring up the name Joe Jorgensen, who was
George Jorgensen and Rudy. Like, for me, just it's the perfect texture of compression and natural sounds to me that I think is what attracts my generation to his music. Because, like, there's two ways to take in music. We come from a generation where you go digging, you take the records home. And I mean, with the notable exception of Primo and Dilla, I don't know many hip hop producers that actually listen and absorb the records, like listen to it over and over and over again until they actually absorb it. And, because a lot of us just skip, put it on 45. Nope. Oh, that's something, and you skip around. But for me, just to me, is one of some of the best engineered music for
sampling.
For the purpose of sampling. But again, it's like you can listen to his music under different scopes, not just like, from a sampling perspective. But that's the thing, you can't categorize it.
One more thing before maybe we let the guests speak.
Right. Let's have a whole episode where he just doesn't talk.
Good thing you brought the keyboard, Bob.
Right.
Yeah.
I'm smiling. I'll just sit here and listen.
So I think the word that you were missing in your intro, and why it's so hard to describe what he did and what he does, is fusion. I think that what he did was basically just another version of fusion jazz.
But I feel like any description for a jazz artist is almost like a 4-letter word. So I kind of try to fusion.
But fusion, is includes obviously whatever many different things that are being fused.
Well, let's ask him, Bob James. Welcome to the show. Finally, 19 minutes later.
That's how we do it.
If all is said and done, and without sort of, oftentimes artists will, and I'm guilty of it, like sort of ducking and dodging the accolades. Like, what would you like us to know you as in describing your artistry?
I don't know that I'd probably be the right person, because so busy doing it, I never could stay in one category for very long. Maybe I was just too restless or something. But at one point earlier in my career, my wife advised me that we were having a conversation about, I thought I was spreading myself too thin and I should focus more on one thing and make up my mind whether I want to be an arranger or a pianist, and in what genre, classical, jazz, or whatever. And she said, stop worrying about it. Just do what you do, and that may be what sets you apart or makes you different from other artists, is that you do a lot of stuff. And so I've kind of stayed with that and not attempted to categorize myself or go too far into one direction, because I love the variety and the challenge of it. Right now I'm trying to meet hip hop head on rather than have it happen off to the side, where they take a chunk of me while I'm not there in the room to be able to defend myself. I was thinking that it might be good to get in there and say, well, wait a minute, before you chop me up, let's see if we can go from beginning to end every now and
Right. Okay. So Bob James, he does a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
then.
But the reason why I said fusion, though, Bob, is because I feel like Tappan Zee Records and a lot of what you've done in your career was not only fusing different types of music together, but also really incorporating the place and the time period into your music, like New York City in the late 70s and early 80s, and you know, the city and the time period. Did that play a lot into the music?
I absolutely always have thought that one of the things about jazz, since it's improvised, so you're giving your feeling right at that moment on that day in that city, wherever you are, that it definitely does represent the time period and what's going on. It should anyway, if we're being honest. We're reflecting our time, and that changes. So I've resisted when people try to make a definition of what jazz is, or because it changes. It changes along with everything else that's going on around it.
Okay.
Yeah, and I'm sorry. Go ahead, Amir.
No, go ahead. Because I was about to go back to the beginning, but
Yeah,
finish your question.
All right, Bob. What was your first musical memory?
Getting fired from being pianist at a tap dance class in my hometown. I think I was 12 or something like that, and I couldn't keep the beat. So the tap dancers were tripping, and finally well, actually, the reason why I got hired in the first place is that I think I was the only pianist in the town that they could use to play for this tap dance class. And I guess it's my earliest memory of trying to learn what keeping the beat meant. Still trying to learn.
Who would have the gumption to fire a 12-year-old?
Yeah, that was pretty cold. Yeah, and I don't exactly remember that, but
and when you say you couldn't,
I may have defined that too harshly. They may have
Okay,
just
good.
nicely told me to go home to my mom.
Passive
when you say
aggressive firing. Okay.
you couldn't keep up, was it with the simple kickball change of it all? Is it one of those kind of classes of beginners? I was just curious if it was.
Damn, why are you with the tap terms?
I mean, come on, you know, I'm a Heinz girl.
Okay.
So was there music around your house growing up?
Not a whole lot. My father was a lawyer, and I lived in a small town in Missouri where what I did hear was mostly country music, and my parents didn't really have that many records that came close to jazz either. I started hearing a little bit and getting intrigued, high school maybe, and I remember kind of liking that feeling that it was improvised as opposed to what I perceived classical music being too much practicing. And jazz represented, at that time, escape from practicing, because you could just make it up, anything that came into your head. And it's only been in more recent years that I decided that practicing even somewhere in relationship to jazz was a good thing and not a bad thing.
So around what year was that when you discovered jazz?
The 1950s, mid 1950s, and I do remember that was pretty much the highlight of the West Coast jazz, because I do remember Chet Baker, Jerry Mulligan, Dave Brubeck, those names formed, or the style of it, the West Coast style, was intriguing to me. And only in college did I kind of try to get more deep.
So I know there's this famous story of was it a talent show or something, some kind of competition where the bands were being judged by Henry Mancini and Quincy Jones. And
how about that for a panel to be judging? It was very a pivotal time in my life. I was at that time I just graduated from the University of Michigan, and there was a kind of big avant-garde group of musicians that I became associated with because they needed performers who were willing to be really daring and do crazy things. The avant-garde world was really out at that time. And so I was incorporating some of those avant-garde things into my jazz trio. And I decided to take the trio down to Notre Dame, where this jazz festival was being held. And it was very conventional. We were expected to play bebop, and I kind of deliberately went up against that and started playing some crazy stuff, along with some bebop. And it caught Quincy's ear especially. I kind of don't remember whether Henry Mancini was into what we did, but Quincy definitely was, and it put a smile on his face, gave me a chance to meet him, and we kind of prevailed at that in the winner's circle at the festival, and Quincy signed me to record deal. So
Was that at Mercury?
gave me confidence to move to New York and go into the jazz business.
Did you finish school?
Yep, I got a master's degree in composition, mostly classical training. My jazz training was extracurricular. I'd go into Detroit from Ann Arbor and look around for a place to sit in.
And so Quincy signed you to, was it Mercury?
Yes, it was, and we recorded the album in Chicago. He was living there, I think, at that time, and that's where Mercury was based in Chicago.
And so this is like the early 60s, right?
Yes, 63, 62, 63.
And so I know that at the end of this small part of the conversation, Quincy eventually recommends you or leads you to Creed Taylor, and that gets you to CTI. But what happens in between there in the mid 60s?
Another big pivotal time was when I got the job with Sarah Vaughan, her music director, pianist, 1965.
Wow.
And I had learned that her pianist, Ronell Bright, had left, and she was looking around, and indirectly Quincy was involved in that too, because where I learned that Sarah was looking for a pianist was at this music copy service in Manhattan, where I used to hang out and watch all the arrangers come in with their charts that music needed to be copied. This was before the computer era, where the copyists were still copying out the parts for the musicians in ink. So anyway, I learned about this possible job, and I had actually met Sarah very briefly once when I was playing with Maynard Ferguson's band at Birdland in New York, and Sarah came in to the club, and Maynard asked her to come up to sing, and of course she didn't have any arrangements with her, so she couldn't do anything with the big band, and that's when my nerves kicked in, because the pianist always kind of gets the responsibility to have to play
the chords,
and once she calls out a song, you better know it, because she wouldn't have come in with any music even for the pianist.
Right.
And I got really, really lucky that night, because she said, "Do you know the sweetest sounds?" And I was able to say fairly quickly, "Yeah, what key?" And this, in the jargon of that time, lets the person who asks you about it know that you're prepared. And at that time, there was a Broadway musical that had just opened up, and The Sweetest Sounds was one of the songs in that musical. It was a brand new song by Richard Rodgers, and I'm drawing a blank on the name of the musical right now. But anyway, I was kind of a fan of musical theater, and it's just complete coincidence that I knew this song. I just barely. Sarah was one of the first cover artists to sing it out of the Broadway show, And so it made an impression on her. And it was at least a year or two after that that I responded when she was looking for a pianist, and she remembered that night, and I got the job.
You know, my tenure in school was like in the 80s and 90s. So of course, I'm in a generation that, you know, grew up with having access to what they would call a fake book. Was there any sort of sheety, you know, fake books of that level back in? Well, you know, those songs were also being written in real time, but like, how does a musician learn these repertoires? Like, you would just have to go to the store and just buy all the sheet music to everything, or were there fake books out back then?
Yeah, in my memory, there were fake books that kept getting bigger as a tool. You know,
As
now
a red,
we have it in our phone. You know, we could look up any song, and
okay,
similar kind of a fake book thing that we could do. But at that time, I'm reasonably sure that this song was so new that it wouldn't have been in the fake book anyway, because it had
okay,
just come out, and I didn't. In Maynard's band, the only thing I would have had on the piano was his charts that I was playing with him. And so when she came in unannounced and was surprised that if I hadn't known that song, might have changed my life, and I probably wouldn't have gotten the gig later.
I see.
Who knows?
So, okay, so hopefully now every time we have a jazz artist on the show, in general, if you're moving to New York City looking to make a living um playing this music, jazz in particular, um you pretty much have to be a wizard at reading music, correct?
I wouldn't say you have to. It
Oh my
was
god, what's up with y'all?
well, you know, there were two different approaches to it. In my case, I think I was pretty clearly thinking that the more training you had, the better. And that just meant it increased your odds of getting a gig. And some of the gigs were not necessarily going to be a jazz gig. You might get a gig playing for a wedding or whatever. And and certain kind of gigs, if you couldn't read, you wouldn't get that gig. But certain jazz gigs, it didn't make any difference whether you read or not, because we all know that the greats that were not readers,
Right.
um, and that's just a particular way. And I felt also, and it I think proved to happen for me with Creed Taylor, he was a very much his style with his label had a lot of production values, and he was adding strings and woodwinds and various things to start out with a basic jazz group, and then give it the same kind of production details that pop artists had. So he needed arrangers to do that, and it turned out that he learned that I was qualified to do it after having been introduced to him by Quincy Jones. So I got that job because of my training, and it helped me get the job.
All right, let's take Valley of the Shadows, uh, which maybe our audience might know that as Group Home's The Realness. Now, Valley of the Shadows, which has so much like Stop on a Dime, you know, just like all this arrangement stuff. So am I to believe like Steve Gadd or Idris Muhammad were given these charts and knew exactly when the like the starts and stops were? Because I'm imagining that you guys can't live in a studio. Like, I come from a place where like I've written complete albums inside the studio, whereas like I'm assuming that jazz musicians have to have this stuff prepared ahead of time. You just go to studio and you knock it out real quick. You don't waste time doing 15 takes, 20 takes or whatnot. So like, do they just study the music, or do you give them a cassette of the arrangement ahead of time and they just commit it to memory?
It was all variations of that over many years. You mentioned Idris Muhammad. In my memory of working with Idris, it's been a long time, but Idris may have been able to read a simple chart, but he was
Okay.
not what we would call a reader. And
Okay.
so if I was going to hire Idris, I wouldn't put a big complicated chart in front of him because even if he did, it would change his approach to playing. And what I wanted from him was his own loose, uh, non-obedient reading a chart kind of style. So in some cases, we were deliberately trying to move away from a kind of written approach to the rhythm section at the basic tracks because we had started during that era of overdubbing and not having everybody in the room at the same time. So for the most part, most of those CTI records, we would record the rhythm section first and the production part of it would come afterwards. So I could work with two different kind of musicians. I could go in on the rhythm section date and do it very loose with minimum kind of chart.
Mhm.
And then once I had that basic track, I'd take that home and score the more complex stuff or the stuff for the larger orchestra. And so I guess we did it both ways. And for a piece like Valley of the Shadows or Night on Bald Mountain, some of those things that were adaptations of classical music, it definitely required a chart and a musician that could read. And
Okay.
so I hired them on the basis of that, and it wasn't categorical because the next day I might want to do something that was totally loose and just play some blues or whatever. And then reading would take that music in the wrong direction.
Got it. In developing your initial sound, who were you idolizing?
Yeah, I wasn't too different from most other aspiring jazz pianists in that I listened a lot to Oscar Peterson and Bill Evans, maybe the two that I listened to the most. Of course, I tried to listen to everybody, Errol Garner and Art Tatum and on and on and on. But I usually came down to thinking that three of those pianists influenced me the most when I was trying to break into the field. And I would add Count Basie to Bill Evans and Oscar Peterson. Count Basie just because his minimalism of playing only a couple of notes every 8 measures, but he knew exactly when to play them. And I love that economy of not playing too much. He was sort of the opposite of Oscar Peterson. And Oscar Peterson had so much chops that I knew I could never do that anywhere close to the way he did it. So I better try to find some other approach.
Is Bill is he partly responsible for why the Fender Rhodes became your signature sound, or was just
No, as a matter of fact, I didn't like the way either Bill Evans or Oscar Peterson played the Fender Rhodes, and they only played it occasionally, and it always seemed to me to sound like they either had to do it or experimented with it and ended up not liking it. If you look at their overall recorded repertoire, you won't find very many Fender Rhodes tracks from Bill Evans or Oscar Peterson. And when I heard them play it, both of them, I hope I'm not being sacrilegious, but they hit it too hard. They hit the keys too hard. They wouldn't change their technique.
They played it like it was an acoustic piano.
Yeah, you can't play that instrument that way because the acoustic piano has so much more dynamic range. And I don't know, it formed my style at that time because I was asked to do it. I hadn't gone out and found Fender Rhodes on my own. Rudy Van Gelder had one in his studio, and I started being asked to play it. And to my ear, I had to change my technique to make it sound good.
was it like now it's so commonplace, but in the early 60s when they're developing this instrument, like was it foreign? Was it like I mean, the way that we look at probably the way that we're looking at AI technology right now, like was it sort of a thing to marvel or something to master? Like, what were your feelings on it?
It was a gig to me. I wasn't even really. I was playing it because I had to. That was my assignment on that particular gig because they wanted
Okay.
Rhodes. When my heart was still with the acoustic piano, until I began to realize that I was getting identified with it, and that I had some kind of approach that people were hearing that almost forced me to take it more seriously. When my album, the first solo album that I made for CTI had "Feel Like Making Love" on it, and there was a sound that I had used Fender Rhodes on Roberta Flack's, because I played piano for her on her version too. So that sound became very much identified. That was what, 1974, I guess.
Hmm.
And um, in some ways I felt limited by it because it just had, no matter what you did, there was only one way that I could make it sound authentic or good.
Okay. So, I kind of want to start in your discography. Um, the period in between the first album, the Bold Conceptions that Quincy produced, and your second album, Explosions, which really doesn't get discussed enough. In
I'm glad it
terms,
doesn't, because if it got discussed too much, I might not have a career now.
yeah, but like what the night and day of those two records. I mean, you know, in 1965, I know by, like 59, 60, like there was avant-garde jazz and whatnot, but your version of it is way beyond, like, Coltrane's thing was more spirituality, and then, like the stuff of The Shape of Jazz to Come and all those things, like, which I think they're being avant-garde with notes, but you're kind of taking, at least listening to those records. I mean, if I could be bold to say, and notwithstanding the early, like, electronic records of the 60s, which were more like demonstration records or that sort of thing, but, like, dare I say, like, that might have been one of the very first electronica records, like, just in terms of you using different frequencies and whatnot. Like, like, what made you go from night and day, from, like, Bold Conceptions to Explosions?
Well, it actually, in my memory, was not totally night and day because they were kind of all related. And there were some elements in the Explosions album that I had already been experimenting around and that had gotten Quincy's attention. The two classical avant-garde composers that participated in the Explosions album were Robert Ashley and Gordon Muma. And they were both exploring different versions of what at that time was called electronic music, but it was a combination of what was called musique concrète, and that was taking just natural sounds like a train engine or birds or whatever, and then manipulating them with tape machines. There was no personal computer. The digital way we look at electronic music now didn't exist at that time.
Mhm.
It was a lot of tape manipulation, and they did have oscillators. So there were some very, very primitive, what we now call synthesizers, that were just beginning to be put together. And what I tried to do with Explosions is I guess you could say it was similar to the way artists use backing track more recently. So this electronic tape of either
Or sampling.
where
Wink.
something, yes. So that's the sample plays or the backing track plays, and then we would improvise over the top of it in a more conventional jazz way. And so the two different elements would clash with each other, and that created the conflict or the avant-gardeness, or and it was all seemed to be all about pushing boundaries. What are the limits of what could be called music? As a sound, organized sound, chaos, and different people used a different approach. Sometimes it was anger and thumbing their nose at the audience. The idea of making an audience happy in the conventional sense, or making them fall in love, they wanted to do the opposite. They wanted to make them so angry that they'd walk out of the theater. And so there was all variations of that, and debate about it, and what's meaningful or what isn't. So you had the people that loved it, but you had as many or more people that hated it and thought it was noise. And so in my youth, I was fascinated by it. I actually loved it at some times. And I always felt during that time that I had the power to change it, because I could play conventional jazz. I liked to surprise my audience, that just when they thought we were just playing some conventional bebop, all of a sudden electronic sounds would come in, and then we were suddenly in a completely different world where I'd be stroking the strings with my hand, or getting a mallet and beating on the side of the piano, and so we were part of the time seducing the audience, and part of the time confronting them with surprise and making them deal with it.
Were you at all at that point? Were you familiar with like artists of the time, like a Raymond Scott, or the Tonto guys, or just any of those experimental synthesizer records?
Yes, I was. Those two names I don't remember, but I was more influenced by the people in the classical avant-garde world, like John Cage and Stockhausen, and those people it was a different kind of experimentation.
Okay.
In the jazz world, Don Ellis, the trumpet player, was also very involved with avant-garde music at that time. And there were the Moog guys. When the Moog synthesizer came into being a little bit later, I actually, by that time, I was sort of losing interest, frankly. The idea of making the audience hate me started to be so severe that I thought, well, I'll never be able to make a living if I make
So you're saying that you were going for more of like a Stravinsky, make the audience hate me thing, or just?
No, because I would say that Schoenberg might be a better example.
Better example. Okay.
Because Stravinsky's music, people realized fairly quickly that it was just great, and it was
they also rioted,
it had melody, it had all of the things, and it's survived as a real classic, even though the dissonance shocked people a little bit at the time. But it was cinematic. I never viewed him as avant-garde. It was more, what would we say about it?
He's a provocateur, musical provocateur.
Yeah, and he had come out of the Impressionist era when the Romantic era of the 19th centuries. Gradually, they began to get tired of tonal music and the tonal and conventional dissonance. And so in the Impressionist era, Ravel and Debussy, it was a blur. And where's the tonic? So by Stravinsky's time, he was going further in that direction, and more dissonance and a less conventional tonality, but still making the attempt to, I don't think to, maybe I'm wrong, but I don't think he wanted his audience to hate him like we were sort of doing at that time. It was
Okay.
it was fun and a temporary interest for me, just trying to learn what were the limits, and I learned just for myself that the limits that I wanted to go back to were far more conventional, and I wasn't really it wasn't reaching my heart. The avant-garde side of it was a curiosity for my brain, but I more and more started to like the romantic side. And probably those 4 years that I spent with Sarah Vaughan, she certainly wouldn't have let me play any avant-garde piano.
Right. Yeah, I was trying to imagine that.
Yeah, I had to really learn the standards, and not only learn them, learn the great voicings and everything, so I could inspire her, and that became my life.
So why did it take almost a decade for you to get to your third album? Like your run of your period, which, for most collectors believe that one is they seem to think that's your first record, even though it's not. But just as the Bob James as we know, why did it take you till 1974 to start your part of the story?
From the after Explosions, and after I kind of was thinking that it was a dead end for me, it was immediately after that I got the job with Sarah Vaughan. That was a 4-year thing. And by that time, I had given up any notion of being a leader. When I first came to New York, I sort of came as the Bob James Trio. I thought of myself as a jazz pianist, and was thinking about trying to make a solo career. But I really liked that job with Sarah, being an accompanist. And I started getting arranging jobs as a result of it, and I liked that. It provided a steadier income in New York, and I was starting to get arranging jobs. And by the time I got to 1970, when I got the job to play on Quincy's album Walking in Space, which was my introduction to Creed Taylor, that gave me the opportunity for Creed Taylor to see what I could do, that I could write for large ensembles. And still, by that time, I was not thinking of myself as a solo artist, and I didn't even think I was going to pursue it.
How musical was Creed Taylor?
Well, he definitely wasn't one going out and playing an instrument or conducting or arranging. He did have some training that I heard about only by reputation. I never saw him do it. I think you could describe him as a visionary. He had a definite idea of how to. He wanted his label to have a style, a sound, and a look. Even his packaging and his choice of covers and everything about it. He had a very strong producer vision, and so the style of the one element of it that he talked to me a lot, because he wanted me to be one of the ones helping him realize his vision, was that he was a fan of, well, he was a very, very passionate fan of the music, and he had his favorites, he had his taste, and that formed his choices that he made throughout those years. But
does he allow you to really have say? Like, I know that you started producing after the 4 out, like, by yourself, but like, are you allowed to have say in these first 4 records?
Definitely did. I had a lot of say. And you mentioned Valley of the Shadows right off the bat, which was completely me going as almost as avant-garde as I would have a project of his, where he was the producer. But he gave me a lot of leeway, and the arrangements. The basic thing that gave me that job early on working with him was that one of his stylistic things was to take a classical theme that he thought that people would recognize, and then convert it into having jazz performers reinterpret it. And that became such a trademark for him almost. And when he saw that I was able to work with classical music and rearrange it and all that's led me down that path with him.
Okay, so take something like Night on Bald Mountain, which, you know, if you're a Disney fan, you know that from Fantasia. I'll admit that I met Night on Bald Mountain because it was on side 3 of Saturday Night Fever. You know, I was also like 7 years old when it came out, when that soundtrack came out. But when you're doing these interpolations of classical music into jazz, one, are you doing all the arranging, and how many man hours does it take for you to write each part? Because I'm assuming that you're doing these arrangements for your brass section, your string section, like for everything. So just for one song, how many man hours does it take for you to write these arrangements out?
A lot. I was fast, and you kind of had to be. I grew up watching the great arrangers, and Quincy had told me about that music copying service that I mentioned about earlier, and I would go in there and watch how they would work. And there were people like Billy Byers, and there were the people that got a lot of the jobs. And I saw how they did their scores and how they set up the scores so that it would make it easier for the copyists to copy the parts, and well organized and everything, because very often there were deadlines where you had to deliver half a dozen charts overnight and for the session the next day. So I learned to be fast. And I definitely wasn't the fastest, but I could put something together pretty quickly, and I had studied it in college, so the part of that whole process was getting to know the range of the instruments and the kind of ways that you could write for an instrument that would make that player sound better if you kept it in the right range. Lots and lots of stuff like that. And I was, the fact that I could do it allowed Creed Taylor to give me directions depending upon what classical piece he wanted me to reinterpret. He'd give me some ideas about it, but then he'd leave me on my own to execute it. And the Night on Bald Mountain chart that I did, and Steve Gadd played the drum part. It was all about featuring him. At that time, I just got to know him, and I knew he could read whatever I put in front of him, but keep it in the spirit of free-flowing jazz playing. Right. And even with that arrangement, we went in first with the rhythm section and recorded that. And I refined my score after that, somewhat based upon the fills that Steve would play. I used to like to do the reverse. Okay. So rather than give Steve all the notes with all those hits on it, the syncopation things, he would just play loose, and I would.
And you build around him.
And when he would hit those fills, I would make that the brass, notes, and it'd make it sound like he was answering the brass arrangement when actually, and some of that stuff he wrote it, and it was tight in the end version because the way he was playing it was loose. You know what I mean?
Okay, because I'm sorry, like I just listening to it, trying to understand it from the perspective of, I'm thinking like you're giving these charts out at the same time, and I was like, wow, I'd never, like, I knew Steve Gadd was a monster, but in my mind, okay, now it makes total sense that you do your rhythm section first, and then you build around what your rhythm section does, and then
yeah. And in order to do that arrangement that way, there had to be a pretty specific chart too, because it wasn't just a simple lead sheet for Steve and the bass player Gary King. All that I had on that particular piece, it was a lot was written out, but within that, since we didn't have the whole brass section in the studio, there was a kind of flexibility that we could use to get the groove happening and to make so that it wasn't too tight and too conservative in the way we played it. So in my memory of what we were trying to do was have both, have it be a very specific chart, but also the feel of a loose improvised jazz performance.
Your personnel, it reads like a who's who of just monsters. Of course, they're monster musicians now, but back then I'm assuming that they were just, dudes that played music. So how did you come across like the Ralph McDonalds of the world, the Grover Washington Juniors of the world, the Wayne
Gary King.
Andre? Yeah.
Steve Gadd, Gary King.
Yeah, I don't think it's any different from what your world is now. New York is a great place, and that's where maybe not quite as dominant as it was in the 1970s when I was doing my thing, but everybody comes to New York and that's where most of the gigs were. And by word of mouth, you start to learn who are the best people. And once I got onto Creed Taylor's list, he had his favorites, but everybody was available to you. You could get George Benson to play guitar on your day. You could get Ray Brown to play bass, and you could get whoever you want because it was New York. And then it just became a matter of casting. And I loved that whole aspect all through my life. I love the conversations about who's the new guy or gal, and who's going to inspire you. And so you keep searching, and every month we would find some new name that got in the door, and you'd want to use them, and the best of them became the people that we're talking about now as a result of that.
Did you and David Matthews ever collaborate at any time?
No, the other David Matthews, there's
Doom David Matthews.
Yeah,
not the Dave Matthews Band, but the arranger Dave Matthews.
Yes.
It was one of those things like Don Sebesky. I rarely was around him. If he got the job, I didn't, and if I got the job, he didn't. So there was usually only one of us on any particular project. I did get hired as a pianist for some of Don Sebesky's stuff, so I got to know him. But the other arrangers, Robert Friedman, I remember, and some of these other people that I knew them by reputation, but rarely had a chance to be working on the same project.
Gotcha.
Okay. So, all right, just the sequencing of your first album is just off the chain. And I gotta know, whose idea was it to make such a radical version of In the Garden? Because, when I hear In the Garden, it's either used for wedding purposes. It's always the pre-song that's played right before Here Comes the Bride or whatever. So I totally wasn't expecting. It's almost like three things in one. Like, it's part rockabilly-ish bluegrass, but it's also jazzy and it's avant-garde. Like, what? Can you just tell us the genesis of that, or was it just like roll the tape? I got an idea.
Well, thank you for describing it that way, and even thank you for remembering it, because I do sort of remember the day that I came into Creed Taylor's office and talked about wanting to do it, to do that composition, and we had already discussed a lot about his basic theory that if a jazz artist took a classical theme, they would turn it into something else, and that was part of his stylistic thing. So the real classical name, which is also I'm drawing a blank on it now, that I ended up calling In the Garden, came from a very well-known classical piece, and at that time I was using Hugh McCracken a lot, the really great studio guitarist, but who had a
He did dueling banjos, right?
yes, yeah,
Yeah,
yes,
Deliverance.
from
yeah.
Deliverance. Yeah.
Deliverance, yeah. So he played banjo, guitar, and he was very authentic in those styles. So I knew that I could get a kind of raw, uh, almost country kind of sound out of him and make that piece eclectic. We didn't know exactly where we were going with it. There was a lot of experimentation in the studio, and Creed Taylor gave me the flexibility to experiment with that and to come up with something unique.
It's almost like, what that in particular was, is if a jazz artist had a public enemy, like that's the thing, like you're so hip hop without the only other person I could describe that way was Prince. Like before Prince purposely started rapping,
Mm,
everything about Prince was hip hop in terms of like drum programming and all that stuff. But I mean, just the fact that you're mixing all these genres in one before it actually gets a home or some sort of identity is kind of mind blowing. I mean, at the time, were you nervous or worried about what critics were going to receive this as? Your
not
your
so much.
downbeats, your whatever the gods of critics of jazz critics were. Like if you're not following, you know, a certain mold of what is deemed acceptable status quo, are you nervous about this, or was the shield of CTI enough to
I think I
protect you to?
can safely say that I was not nervous about it. If anything, I was not reluctant to be confrontational and to not give critics any easy thing to talk about. So, and uh, I guess I always had a little bit love-hate relationship with them, and I got more hate than I did love during the times, and so ended up saying, "Who cares?" And it's my job to do it, and their job to say what they think about it. And I was not concerned about that at that time. Even forget about critics. I was not that concerned about Creed Taylor. He was my boss. But I wanted to confront him too, and not necessarily come in with exactly what he expected. The bravery, I guess, has always been something that I feel like you have to stay with your vision, no matter whether people will agree with it or not. And on the one album we were talking about, I was not thinking at that time as a solo career album for myself. I didn't think I would have one. And Creed said it was time, because I'd done so many projects for him with Grover Washington and various other artists. I felt my identity at CTI was arranger. And by doing a whole bunch of different eclectic kind of stuff, I was hoping to use that as like an audition to get more arranging jobs. And the more variety that I could show as an orchestrator, I could to present it to other clients. And it was my good fortune that I had some commercial success with it, that I was almost forced into considering a solo career after that. Can I share with you a little bit about Nautilus on that same album?
That was
Yes,
next.
please.
Talking to so many people about it and actually confronting with Wu-Tang Clan guys and various people about why. I kept asking the question, why did Nautilus get sampled by so many people? What was it? And I was able to share the story on that same one album. You asked about the sequencing. The Nautilus was the last cut on side B, kind of deliberately, because it was almost a throwaway, and Creed Taylor knew that the other cuts would get the attention at that time. So traditionally with the LP, you always put your weakest cuts on the center, the last cut on the side of an album, because the grooves were narrower. You got your best bass sound on the outside cuts. So nobody paid attention to Nautilus. And then however many 10 or 15 years later, I started hearing back that the hip hop producers were grabbing onto it, and I could not. I knew it had a good bass line, and Idris Muhammad playing drums, the groove was there, so I got that. But it just seemed like there had to be something else about it that made it just keep showing up over and over, and it still does, even to this day. So in a conversation with RZA on the interview that he was doing, suddenly something clicked in for me that I had kind of not been paying attention to at all. But it wasn't just a simple rhythm section groove that Idris and Gary King were laying down. I had written a pretty elaborate string arrangement that for fun. Agreed, let me do it. There was enough budget that I could hire a string section and write the arrangement. And there was this kind of mysterious, ethereal kind of sound that permeated that track. And if anything, I would have thought it would have made it less commercial because it didn't fit in with the other standard funk type of a string arrangement that I might have written. But as I've recently talked to the people in the hip hop community that keep talking about that as being one of the essential tracks that have been sampled the most, I think it might be a combination of that groove and this almost classical blurry orchestration that's over the top of it. That
Texture.
Yeah, texture. Thank you.
It's that's what I say. You're the king of textures. Like, and I can't describe it, but it's, somehow you manage. Like, I know you don't intentionally say, okay, let me create a song that somehow in 6 years will hit another generation. Like, no one thinks that. Like, maybe a musician like me now will think that, like, okay, what I do now, maybe 20 years from now, it'll be in vogue. But I think at the end of the day, you caught a compelling performance with musicians that just were tightly locked. And the fact that you didn't plan it even makes it better, because some of the best success stories in music all come from people that aren't calculating, here's lightning in a bottle. Like Michael Jackson trying to follow Thriller. Like, I'm going to sell 100 million albums. Like, you can't capture lightning in a bottle that way. It just happens or it doesn't happen. So
yeah, I totally believe it, and that's why I've always tried to just enjoy the process of doing it and let whatever comes out of that happen. If you're passionate and if you're trying your best to get the best people, write the best arrangement, play the best solo, just do your best and keep trying to make the level higher in that way, then you're still enjoying that, even if it isn't successful. You've had that pleasure and privilege to make music and go through that process.
this is like our first, even though wait a minute, Steve. Yes, we played with him before, correct?
Yeah, he sat in with the
Yeah, he
Rich
sat
on
in with us.
Late Night with Jimmy
Sanford
Fallon.
and we came in and you,
Right.
I have very, very fond memories of it because you let me meet the guys in the band, and you had rehearsed a couple of my tunes that weren't going to end up being on the show.
Explain to me then versus now. I'm certain now you definitely have a better grasp of what it is that hip hop culture is doing. But, around 87, when, Peter Piper is coming out the gate, which, I'll probably, you would say Fonte, that's probably one of the first out the gate Bob James samples. Peter Piper, right?
Peter Piper, yeah.
Yeah, so
the 80s, 86, 87, yeah.
Yeah, so when this is coming out in 86, 87 and whatnot, what is your immediate thought of what's happening?
Yeah,
into time with
I believe my first memory was Jazzy Jeff and the Fresh Prince, and
Touch of Jazz.
Oh, Touch of Jazz.
Yeah,
you're right.
And they took my song Westchester Lady And the way they did it at that time, because I wasn't following what was going on in hip hop at all. But I found out about it after the fact, and I listened to it. And yes, I was shocked. So what the heck, because it was just my record that played. It wasn't even a loop or a chunk.
Right.
And you could hear my melody, my composition, and suddenly I look at this album and it has a new title. They made it into a new song, and they called it something else. And I'm thinking, wait a minute, this is not right. What's going on here? And one of the first things back then that came into my mind is, hey, if they can do that, if Jazzy Jeff and Will Smith could just rap over the top of my record, well, I'll go out and get myself a Frank Sinatra record, and I'll play some piano over the top of it, and I'll change the title on it from I left my heart in San Francisco. I'll call it Bob James something or other, whatever. And I knew you could.
Ghostface does that, by the way.
So times have changed. So,
right.
But that was my first reaction, and also.
But in your mind, you didn't think like some 14-year-old or 15-year-old is hearing that and now looking at their parents' record collection like, wait, I have that. And then now you have new fans?
Not yet.
Okay.
Eventually, there was a lot of conversation about it. And if it had been just a fluke, I would have considered it more as a legal matter. And because throughout my sort of music business knowledge career, I have felt that copyrights and the protection of them are our most powerful weapon against big business. That if the copyright itself, the ownership of it, the control of it, so that that you have some control over your destiny was a very big deal for me. I fought for it in all of my contracts, and the only way that you can protect it is by going to bat for it and not let people plagiarize or fraudulently steal it. So that was really basic before I even was aware of what was going on in the hip hop world.
Okay.
And the whole structure of the legal thing hadn't happened yet, where you could figure out a reasonable, fair way to license and all.
Yeah, it was the Wild West.
So yeah, exactly. So you hear that happening, and I owned my recording of Westchester Lady, and the compositions. So I had to fight for it, and I did. And that sort of started me off in this world that at that time I thought it was a one-off thing, and that I would just have to try to do my best to be compensated properly and then go on about my business. But it proved that it wasn't an isolated thing. And not only did the field get bigger and bigger, but the sampling of my music kept happening. So I had to make a decision about how to handle that. And eventually, yes, it became a very amazing deal that my own music got heard a lot more as a result of my name being associated in the hip hop community. So I ended up being very grateful for it, but always mixed feelings.
Did you notice an immediate paradigm shift in reaction? Whereas, like, if you start the intro to Nautilus back in 1974, it probably wouldn't elicit the screams of, oh, shit, like that. I'm certain that happened at Blue Note last week when you played there.
Yes, and it's drastic change has happened. I have so much appreciation and new respect, new desire to confront this whole phenomenon. Of I want, as a copyright holder and as a composer who has fought hard to keep the rights to my music, I want to be one of the people in the music community that educates young people to learn about that, to learn about the business, to learn that these creations need to be protected and they need to be identified in the right way and entered into the legal part of the music business in a legitimate way. So I've kept fighting for that. But as I have learned more about the sample usage, I confronted RZA, and I I actually confronted DJ Jazzy Jeff too, and there's a new cut on my album that'll be coming out in the spring that is a collaboration with DJ Jazzy Jeff, where it's like let bygones be bygones. We're not only friends, we're in bed together with a track. We collaborate, and I'm very happy that we're able to do that in a way that demonstrates that we're all in the music business together. But in attempting to actually confront this issue for me, which is when they took Nautilus or Take Me to the Mardi Gras and redid it or used it, it was my creativity that was in this chunk or in this recording, and I was not in the studio to defend myself artistically. And as I began to hear my music being sampled more and more, the chunks of it were taken in all kinds of different ways, manipulated more drastically, tempo change, sped up, slowed down, distorted.
Kind of like Explosion.
Kind of like Explosions, only I didn't have any control over the creativity.
Right.
I'm not there, so they do whatever they want. So I began to think if I could be in the same room doing my thing while they did their thing, a different result could come out of it where I would actually at least be able to say, well, wait a minute, don't change this or something like that. So for 5 days, 2 weeks ago, I was in RZA's studio and we did pretty much exactly that.
Wow.
He did his thing and I did my thing. And a couple of times I would do a kind of conventional jazz melodic thing or a bass line thing or something like that. And he would hear some very small chunk of it, and he would ask his engineer, stop right there and take just these 2 beats, and suddenly my conventional melody had become some completely new rhythm that I wouldn't have thought of in a million years. And now we're confronting each other. So
Fonte.
Either I have to be strong enough to say, stay away from that, or go along with it.
Yeah.
Fonte, are you thinking about the Guitar Center beat right now?
Oh man, I hope it's not that. I think it's not gonna be that, but yeah, fake Guitar Center beat. That's a whole other thing. RZA, yeah.
No, for me, the person who takes that and makes, I feel like someone's gonna flip it, like either vitamin D or something.
And make it hard. Yeah,
it's a long inside joke.
Oh yeah,
it's one of RZA's most unorthodox creations I've ever heard in my life. So when I heard you two were collaborating, the first thing I thought about was, okay, the Guitar Center beat. Okay.
Bob, do you recall? Do you remember the reasons why you cleared Daytona 500, but you didn't clear the Flowers record for Ghostface? Do you remember the reason for that?
I do remember in those days we were trying to create a kind of formula, which almost never worked because every new creation is different and every circumstance is different. But I tried to identify it in the amount of my actual recording that was used. And if it was just a little chunk that only occupied, 10%, I tried to base the licensing fee on the prominence of my music in the track. And if my bass line or my melody was prominent all the way through the track, it's essentially my composition that I own, and that I own that copyright, and they're using it from beginning to end. I always was pretty firm and rigid about no, I'm not giving that up. And I don't think any composer who's proud of the ownership of their creation would ever want to give that up and just say.
I mean, you say not giving it up, you mean not giving up any publishing on it, or just not letting them use it, period?
Well, either version, yes. Not letting them use it, period, unless they license it properly. If they licensed it, and to get a license to change my music when they use it from beginning to end, that why? I mean, why would any of you agree to do that? So here you've got this song that
I think well, you asked the question, why would any of us agree to do that? I think definitely it has to be you have to be compensated and the business has to be worked out. I just know for me as a hip hop fan, there are so many records that I never would have listened to if it were not for hip hop. Like I never would have went and listened to, your first four, well, not first four, but your albums 1, 2, 3, and 4. You know what I'm saying? Like I never would have went back to those records had I not heard them in this context now. You know what I mean? So for me now, I look at it as just, kind of just planting that seed and putting it in a context that we may not understand, but the generation after us, they may hear it and, it goes, it's pretty much, I look at what sampling was back for us back then. It's like what meme culture is now in the internet. You know what I'm saying? Like my son, he, watched The Wire, and all because there's a GIF of Weebay that's like been used as a meme a million times.
Right.
But to him, it was just, oh my God, so that's where that came from. Like, this is a 17-year-old.
Oh, that's right. That is the new sampling.
Yeah, it's like
that is crazy.
I would say in defense of the way this thing started to come together in the legitimatizing of licensing and all of that, many of the biggest samples of my music, such as Peter Piper, I didn't find out about until even 2, 3, 4 years later.
After the fact.
Was too late. And I suffered, even if I wanted to confront, the statute of limitations prevented me from really being able to do what I wanted to do in some of the cases to protect my copyright. Couldn't do it. So it was, Questlove just called it the Wild West. And yes, it was during that time. You fend for yourself and you don't know the history of how it's going to turn out. If I had known that, I would have had so much respect from the whole hip hop community, and they treat me with so much dignity. It makes me so happy and proud that I'm a part of it. And I know that I have gotten a lot from the fact that it historically happened. But when it was the Wild West, when all that stuff was going on, I had no idea. And I was fighting for my own image as a jazz artist and had a hard enough time with that, let alone have a hard time holding on to my own compositions.
I understand.
Are there certain songs that you favor, like of your usage? Like for me, I feel like DJ Premier is probably the most ideal person to have utilized your work, where it's not just straight up jacking it, but it's like the way he does it is amazing. But like for you, do you have favorites of like, oh, that was clever, or that sort of thing?
A little bit. By the way, I really loved meeting him last week. He had come a year ago, but finally had a chance to meet him and talk with him a little bit last week at the Blue Dome.
Yeah.
Such a cool guy. And I am embarrassed in some ways to admit that I still don't listen to that much hip hop music. I don't.
Guess what? Neither do we.
Yeah. So I'm not well versed to talk about it.
Okay.
But because of the opportunity to be up on the stage with Talib Kweli and his other guests, finally I got some very great insight into the performance of rap and hip hop and the way it feels like jazz when I'm up on the stage, and the skill and the spirit of it. that I had not paid attention to in listening to the recordings, but being there with them was fantastic.
Wait, let me explain to our listeners. So basically Mr. James did a 3-night residency at the Blue Note in New York City with Talib Kweli, Black Thought was there, Rakim was
and
there.
DMC.
Yeah, like just basically, is this the first time that you finally had a meeting of the minds between yourself and hip hop MCs and a band that knew how to make this happen?
I did the same thing with Talib last year.
Okay.
So that was the only other time, and I really liked that in the way of getting to know in real time. The music's happening, the tune starts, and I'm playing right along with them. And when Rakim was playing his version where he had sampled my piece Shambuzi,
Yeah.
and it made me smile because I remembered percussion player that I used to work with all the time, Doc Gibbs.
Yeah.
Doc Gibbs had given me the title Shambuzi, which was kind of part of his vocabulary. And it just brought back a whole bunch of memories. And this, again, that was just an intro for me, that the melody or the main part of that song, Rakim didn't use it at all. It was just those chords in the intro. Nevertheless, I loved the way he performed on stage with such confidence and charisma, and it made me proud, happy, and smiling that he had chosen my, as something to create a new piece out of it.
What were your thoughts on Everyday People or People Every Day by Arrested Development? Because I thought that was just a genius, like taking that little piece. Like, to me, that was genius. What were your thoughts on it?
Very, very complicated from the business end of it. And actually, even from, it was another example of something that I was not paying attention to, didn't know that my sample had even been used until way after the fact.
Oh, wow.
Way after it had become a big hit. So it came to me late in the game. And what had happened was that the People Every Day had been released as a single without my sample on it. The first release that came out didn't have my recording on it and kind of didn't go anywhere. And they kept working with it, did a new mix, which ended up being called a Metamorphosis mix. Did add my sample, and that became a big hit. And so quite clearly, I knew that my sample had made a difference in that record. But what we did not know at the time, and until it got litigious and kind of got a little bit ugly, shall we say?
Serious, right?
And this may or may not have had anything to do with their management, but more the record company's management. When the royalties came in, they somehow or other got channeled into the other version of. It did not have my sample in it, so the royalties did not come my way. And after a long period of time, and it was a very significant difference.
So that's why they had to identify the Metamorphosis remix every time I see it used in public.
Yeah, but even though they did, some unbeknownst to me and couldn't, in the final analysis, couldn't prove it anyway. Right. It got channeled wrong, and it took us a long time before we even figured out, well, why is this statement for the other version so huge and the statement for Metamorphosis makes nothing?
Because no one wants to write Metamorphosis mix. I assure you, I assure you, 99% of the time, if someone's playing that song, they're definitely playing your version, and that's
all the TV appearances and everything else. That was the version that became a hit. But I probably shouldn't even be talking about the details of this because there was a settlement that we finally reached and
Okay.
it was not particularly good. But so I don't have good memories about that. Let's put it that way.
Gotcha. You have good memories about Taxi, the Angela
thing.
Yeah, Angela's thing.
Well, of course, that's all good news for me. You know, kind of, I could have never anticipated how that would become such a signature piece for me. And I thank the producers of that series, which is still in syndication. But the most weird, but it turns out to be very celebratory, sample usage of it turned out to be CeeLo Green when he used it on a tune called Sign of the Times recently, and he just kind of sang over it, redid it, added a lyric to it, and at first it was a little bit shocking when I first found out about it because they hadn't come to me in advance about it either. But when I first heard it, I loved it so much that I just couldn't be anything but happy about it, and we ended up with a really fair and nice licensing arrangement, and it has led to me being able to meet him in person in a similar way that I confronted RZA recently. But CeeLo and I did some stuff together, and we wrote a song together that's going to be on this same new album.
Okay.
Mine. But if you haven't heard Sign of the Times by CeeLo, it's my Taxi piece reinterpreted by him.
Wow.
Okay. Well, wait. You mean the Sign of the Times that Rod Temperton worked on? That
Oh, that's
piece?
my Sign of the Times. So
Yeah.
Sign of the Times, yeah, right, that Rod Temperton worked on is on my album.
Okay.
The CeeLo version, which he called Sign of the Times, has his lyric that has Sign of the Times in the lyric.
I see.
It's
So you have another version, another song called "Sign of the Times" that's not
right.
related to the Temperton
Does
version.
Prince have one too? There's several Sign of the Times songs, but
I got
his Sign of the Times has my Taxi melody and a very, very cool but very specific reinterpretation of it that is it was a great opportunity for me to meet him and collaborate.
I want to ask about your gear. I know that, you know, as a creator who, you know, since the Explosion record, like you've been experimenting with like electronic sonics and whatnot. But I do know like a lot of those early synthesizers that were available in the 70s were monophonic, which kind of makes it limiting for you to play chords or anything. Like you got to play one note. But I know like around 76, 77, when they were making polyphonic synthesizers, which allows you to make chords, are sort of manufacturers, the Yamahas of the day or the electronic makers of the day, are they courting you? Are you getting endorsements? Are you sort of in that Stevie Wonder way where, you know, they go to him and Herbie Hancock with all this new gadgetry and like, here, like use our stuff? And in the late 70s and 80s, like what was the courting system like with keyboard makers and you?
I don't remember exactly when I got endorsement from Yamaha, but I've been affiliated with them for many, many years now. Specifically the Disclavier, the acoustic piano that has MIDI capability that I use all the time. I love it. And I have a montage and motif, whatever. I use a lot of Yamaha gear, and I am affiliated with them. Most of the rest of my gear throughout has been, I pay for it, and I go to the music store and buy it, whatever.
Okay.
Era, you were talking about the polyphonic synthesizers. I can remember the early stages of that when it was very primitive by today's standards, and Oberheim was the company that I remember that had the polyphonic synthesizer that had separate oscillators for each sound. So in the Oberheim 8 voice was the one I used a lot, that you could play polyphonically on it, but each note and the chord was going to it through a different oscillator and manipulated very differently than the way the more recent polyphonic synthesizers are. So that gave it a character. Each oscillator, you could kind of tweak it, and there was a thickness about it that gave that Oberheim 8-voice, where I made a lot of records using that. And I remember that they were also funky in the sense that, yes, you could play 4, 6, 8 note chords, but it was, the synthesizer was trying to catch up. If you tried to do anything too fancy or too fast, changing, it didn't behave like a piano would.
Okay.
So if you held the notes down, you could do a string pad or something like that. But if you tried to do something really, really technically fast with it, it was clumsy.
So
I wanted, go ahead.
go ahead. Go ahead, Fonte.
I was just going to ask. I wanted to make sure we got any questions about foreplay. I used to do my homework to those records in school, in high school. So I specifically just wanted the Between the Sheets album and Elixir, like those. Like I played those records, like back and forth. Wanted to ask one: how did all you guys come together? And specifically, do you have any memories of recording Why Can't It Wait Till Morning with Phil Collins? What that session was like?
That's my shit.
Many, many, many great memories from those years. In 1991, I think it was, I was headed out to Los Angeles working on an album of mine. That album ended up being called Grand Piano Canyon. And I had brought Harvey Mason to New York many, many times to play with me, because most of my sessions were being done in New York at that time. Mm-hmm. But I had also Lee Ritenour had used me on a project of his, and we were dealing with wanting to do reciprocal. So if I do something for you, play for you, I want you to play on my album, whatever.
Favor.
Lee owed me a reciprocal, and since he was LA based, I thought it might be more interesting for me to go to LA and use both Lee Ritenour and Harvey Mason on my album. So I planned it and didn't know who to hire on bass. Wasn't that familiar with the LA scene. So I asked both Lee and Harvey, who should I use on bass? And separately, both came up with the same answer, Nathan East, who I had not met, never had worked with him before. And I found myself in the studio with those three other guys, Nathan, Harvey, and Lee, and something clicked, and all four of us could just feel it wasn't like a regular recording session. The combination of our backgrounds, our things that we had worked on, different projects, whatever, it just felt really special. And on a break, we had a conversation about the idea of how do groups get formed? How did Weather Report get formed? How did the Modern Jazz Quartet get formed? When did they decide to put a name on it and be a group rather than an individual? And one thing led to another. I had an A&R job at Warner Brothers Records, and I was able to go to a meeting there and say, will you give us a budget to experiment and do a project, never thinking about it becoming a full-time long thing. It was at that time, maybe just one project was all we were thinking about. But the first song of Restoration, my composition on my album, was what we remember as being kind of like the first idea of a foreplay sound.
Okay, so speaking of Warners, I always wanted to know this, and I'm not asking this because, again, like I'm not asking this because you're categorized in a certain type of jazz, but I always wanted to know, in 1977, when Tommy LaPuna and George Benson create the Breezin' record, which was such a breakthrough album in terms of the multiple nominations that it got for Grammys and whatnot. People were pretty much ready to dismiss George Benson, and not dismiss him, but even he said like, well, I'm at the end of my rope. Let me make this last record real quick and then retire. And then suddenly Reason blows up. But did you see the embracing of that album as a victory for the type of jazz that you were doing, the type of instrumental music that you were doing, the fact that that album was somewhat embraced by the mainstream community and given all those accolades, all those Grammy nominations and whatnot?
Yes, I was experiencing it from a distance, having done some collaborating with George when he was at CTI, and I was a little bit familiar with the complicated exit from CTI and when he went over to Warner Brothers, and the sort of transition from just being a guitar player to a singer, and watched what was in George's mind and what he really wanted to do. And somewhat later, after he went to Warner Brothers, I also got the job of producing one of his records. And at that time, the big bosses of Warner Brothers gave me the assignment of wanting him to play more guitar. But as I started to work with him, his heart was in singing more. And I could see that has always been a conflict. And a lot of people, jazz fans, just are aware of the genius that comes out of his fingers when he plays guitar, that nobody else can do it. But the whole other part of his personality felt that talent that he had as a singer too. And in the Breezin' album, both were happening. Both, of course, Masquerade, and every time I hear Breezin', that tune,
Right.
the same thing happens to me. There's no bridge, which was for us at that time is unusual. It's just the same. It's the same key, and it just keeps repeating. Those 8 bars, and and it's just simple. It never goes away from it. And some of us who have all these things we think about, stay with the hook. Don't go away from the hook. Don't get too cute. Don't get too complicated, because the fans want to hear that melody. And the way that record was produced was so clearly on the money in terms of drive home that hook, drive home the uniqueness. It just made me want to go back to the drawing boards. I want to try to do that. I want to try to do something similar. But then you realize it's not easy to find that magic.
I think a lot of our fan base might not know that Breezin' was written by Bobby Womack. It's actually a Bobby Womack cover, which I did know. I just recently found the Bobby Womack original, and I tend to forget that Bobby Womack was actually a good guitar player. So that was an instrumental on one of his records in 1971.
And I'm getting to know Questlove as a musicologist too.
Nah, we're just music nerds, man. That's all.
I should be taking notes, because I got to go back. I knew that sort of in my distant memory, but I don't think I ever heard Bobby Womack's version.
Yeah, no, it's damn near the same song, just with a harder. Well, when we say harder, more like a hip hoppers should jump on it. Like it's actually amazing. The drums are more cracking on the Womack version. What were you going to ask, Steve?
Well, we kind of breezed right over it. The time period that I wanted to talk about, Bob James had the coolest, one of the most iconic jazz labels of all time with Tappan Zee Records, and I'm a little curious about the timetable, because you were A&Ring at Columbia. Was that during the CTI years when you were arranging and also playing on CTI records?
I kind of had reached the end of my CTI after my 4 solo albums, that ended up around 1977, and there were some problems with CTI in the business world too, and in the lack of payment of royalties, etc., which necessitated me litigating there. I'm beginning to make it sound like I'm a
Litigious James.
litigious, but I hope I wasn't in the long version of that. But there have been times when I've had to protect, and in this case, I'm glad I did, because I ended up with the ownership of my 4 records, which made it possible for me to make many things happen. So I left in 1977, negotiated with Columbia, and signed there, where Bruce Lundvall was the president. And he did give me the opportunity to start a small custom label with the idea that I could do a continuation of sort of the CTI approach, in which I had done enough in this role of arranger conductor for Creed Taylor that my intention was to not do exactly what Creed Taylor did, but my version of it, and to try to develop my own style, but influenced by him. And very early tonight, you mentioned Joe Jorgensen, for many memories, and I wanted Joe Jorgensen to be my Rudy Van Gelder, because Rudy Van Gelder was a very unique engineer for Creed Taylor, and his style of engineering, the sound of those records were very different from anything else that was out there. And in my experience of doing studio work in New York, Joe was the guy that I thought had the most interesting ears, and that the 2 of us could collaborate on trying to come up with our own sound.
Would Rudy pre-mix the stuff, or like would you guys track first, then mix afterwards?
That's a very good, funny question, because Rudy was extremely secretive about any of his techniques, and he did not like sharing. He did not like anybody asking him any questions about
You knew what my next question was. I was like, share the secrets.
So I got the job of writing these arrangements on where we'd have the basic tracks, and all Rudy would be willing to give me was this rough of 2-track from the basic sessions, and I would take that home and listen to that to make my arrangements. And the mix on those roughs that he sent me were the worst, most crude, no reverb, no ambience, nothing, because he didn't want to let anything out of his studio that could even possibly be released. And so that memory of his mixing is so completely different from the way anybody else worked.
Wait, do you have a dry Rudy flat mix in your possession?
Well, I have many reel-to-reels, if I could find a reel-to-reel player that would play them.
I'm begging you to make a compilation of just dry, because the thing is until like Steve really got me into like listening to Steve's obsession with CDI, like, and I'm sorry for really carjacking this interview, Steve. Like, Steve is a CTI ecologist. So the thing is that when I started studying Rudy's mixing thing, I never was a fan of compression because I never liked being squeezed. But somehow on your records, on Grover's records, like certain CTI product, there's kind of I don't know, I can't, I don't have the proper eloquence to say the right words to describe Rudy's texture and his relationship with reverb and compression, but like, yeah, that's the secret sauce that I'm dying, because I feel like that is the apex of 70s production that I can't master just yet. And
go to his studio. It's still open. Let's go
and
record
still
there.
unscathed and still.
Yeah, it's exactly the same.
I'm in the same boat as you, even though it was almost like a full-time job being there every day in that studio for 5 or 6 years. And I never learned much about the details of it either, because he wouldn't talk about it. He wouldn't share anything. Every one of all of his gear, like his equalizers or compressor, anything like that he had taped over the manufacturers, the names of them, so he didn't even want you to know what they were.
That's hip hop. See, that's hip hop. That's hiding the labels. Like y'all don't even know that y'all following a cycle.
So yeah, hey guys, Bob James had one of the most iconic jazz labels of all time called Tappan Zee Records, and and yeah, I just wanted to. I found it really interesting what artists you chose to have leader albums on Tappan Zee. Obviously, you had so many of your own records on that label as well, but I wanted to just run some names by you that might not necessarily be household names for our listeners or for us. And if maybe you could just give us just a brief, blurb about them, because I'd be interested. Wilbert Longmire.
Yeah. I found out about Wilbert through George Benson. Actually, he and George Benson were friends, and George had heard him, and loved the way he played guitar, and couldn't get.
He's a singer. He's a singer.
Yeah, he sang and played guitar, and to get a recommendation from George Benson is about as good as you could hope for. So that's the main reason why I signed Wilbert, and it was at a time when I was very much in the heat of wanting to be a good follow-up to the CTI sound, but my own version of it.
Wow.
And that was the end result of it.
Okay. Joanne Brackeen.
Well, very, very original pianist, amazing. She could not be produced in any kind of a way like some of the other more fusion artists that I had a chance to work with. She was completely her own person. And so my role with her in some ways was to try to be like what I would want a producer to be with me if I just had complete authority to do whatever I wanted to do. And I knew that it would be a kind of simple production because she just wanted to play jazz with a great rhythm section, and make sure we had the best engineer for her, get the right sounds for her, and let her do her own thing. That was pretty much my goal with Joanne.
There was an artist named Mark Colby that did a couple of records on Tappan Zee.
Yeah, he toured with me a lot, played in my band, and I've always loved the power in his playing, and I could treat him similarly to the way I tried to treat Grover Washington, for example, another saxophone player for that label. Very fond memories of those records.
And Richard T., the piano player, did a leader album or two on Tappan Zee as well. Yeah,
well, Richard, being a member of that Stuff rhythm section that had Eric Gale on guitar and Gordon Edwards bass and Ralph McDonald percussion, they were a kind of quintessential top of the line R&B based rhythm section, and Richard T's unique kind of heavily church influenced combination organ and sometimes Fender Rhodes. I just loved everything about him. I was trying to emulate some of his feel because I was alongside him on many sessions where some of Quincy Jones dates and a lot of New York studio dates, Richard would be on organ and I would be on piano, or sometimes trade off or whatever. So getting to know him that way and realizing what a uniquely great artist he was, of course, he was an obvious one for me to try to sign.
And Steve Kahn, the guitar player, I think that was the first Tappan Zee record?
Might have been. Steve was very determined that he wanted the Columbia identity on his album also, so he allowed me to put the Tappan Zee logo on it, but
he wanted the red label, not the blue.
Kind of like that, but Tappan Zee didn't have enough prestige, and that he needed the name on there too. And he and I were friends, and also being
He
a
was on, he
small
was
label and smaller budgets,
Mhm.
I was somewhat limited to sign the people that were within my sphere that I either knew or that I knew that they were available.
Just a couple more. Mongo Santa Maria.
Well, yes, and he came through the bigger label as well, and um, a particular kind of sound, the Latin American sound that I wasn't doing with anybody else, made it possible for us to make some pretty cool records with him.
And where did you come across Alan Harris?
Came to me through Columbia, through just and the most unusual Tappan Zee project, I guess.
Mhm.
The one that I had the least influence over.
Yeah, you can tell. You can tell.
I don't remember doing anything musically on it other than making it possible for him to do his thing and trying to treat him the way I would have wanted to be treated as a producer. Make it possible for him to create his music.
Okay, the last one, and the one I want to know the most about, it seemed to be kind of your partner at the label, which was Jay Chataway. Can you tell us a little bit about him?
Well, I think I had maybe originally found out about him through Maynard Ferguson, because he had done a lot of arranging for Maynard, and I was in need of somebody that had the same kind of arranging background as me, because I was not able to keep up with the requests that I was getting to do arrangements. So I started working with him in that way. I got to know him a little bit. And we hit it off, and I knew he had a similar approach to sound production. And yeah, we had some really very good years and have remained friends. He's a big sailor fan. He and his wife live on a boat a lot of times of the year. They take their boat to various places and just take up residence. For a long time, he moved after Tappan Zee stopped. He moved to LA and had a very successul career as a movie composer, and he was very involved in the Star Trek series. Very, very talented guy.
Let me just wrap up the Tappan Zee thing, Amir. You did such an incredible job with that label. Really, the best thing that a label can do, which is create a whole world unto itself, with all the beautiful continuity with the album covers, the beautiful gatefold album covers, and you really knocked it out of the park with Tappan Zee. It was, I mean, it's really something. You're welcome for all the rabbit holes, folks out there with all those names, but all those Tappan Zee records are great.
They are.
Just a little short
Except maybe not the Alan Harris record.
Well, I wasn't going to say that.
You said it now.
Short thing, since you mentioned Joe Jorgensen, I more and more think that there just aren't really any total coincidences in life, that some things just happen for a reason. Recently, I was contacted by Joe's son, Michael Jorgensen, who's interested in doing a biography on me, and he works with a video production company, and I've been starting up a project in which he's going to do a biographical thing. He's a member of the group Wilco, who's successful group. Yeah. But when he grew up, when he was, I don't know, 10 or 12 years old, his father, Joe, would invite him into the studio where we were making all those records during that period of time. And he formed his taste and everything else based upon listening to all of those records. And so many, many years later, after he's gone into business as a keyboard player and had a lot of success with Wilco, now we're meeting again, and it gives me a chance to pay my respects and have such fond memories of all those great records that Joe did with.
Yeah, you hear that, Amir? Stay on good terms with your engineer. It could pay off.
Yes, whatever, Steve.
Very important.
Wait, one last question for me, and then I'll duck out. But your very first production was on another Creed Taylor label called Salvation with Gabor Szabo, the Hungarian guitar player. What was that like, your first production, and what was Gabor Szabo like? 1975.
The unique aspect of that for me was it was the only time that I was able to actually produce and do something without Creed Taylor being there. It was his label, but he gave me the flexibility to just do that project on my own. And I went out and to LA and did it. And Gabor was definitely a gypsy, and he had his own style of approach, which I tried to keep that gypsy aspect, but to try to bring some of my own style into it. I wish I could have done more with him, because he's kind of like an ideal artist for an arranger to produce, because I want to have the tapestry surrounding him, but I want him to be able to stay within his own style, and that's what I was trying to do.
Wow. Gary McFarland worked a lot with him in that regard.
Yes, definitely. I love Gary McFarland's work. In fact, I was very influenced by it. I used to study his records to try to figure out how he made his choices.
Yeah.
The Sign of the Times record. Now, I get the feeling I'm about to answer my own question, say Quincy Jones, but I'll ask you, how did you get involved with Rod Temperton working on that album?
Quincy introduced me to Rod, and he was in the studio on a couple of the records that I was involved with Quincy, and I was a big fan and admirer, and Quincy put us together because he thought that we might hit it off. And even though Rod specifically with his talent was not a classical music, not, I didn't think that much of an influence. But as I was working with him, he just had a whole cinematic, classical way of talking to me, and we hit it off. And I was trying to learn from him. I don't think Thriller I can't remember where he was.
He just finished off The Wall, and Thriller's about to come the next year.
Yeah, so big. In other words, kind of out of my league, and I was kind of shocked that he was even willing to spend some time with me. But at least I had a chance to work in the studio with him. He had his own complete language of how he talked and how he put together his vocals, and they were totally different from anything that I was aware of. So it was very much a learning process. And the difference, I guess the main difference in the success there was that when he worked with me, he had Bob James, and when he worked with Michael Jackson, he had Michael Jackson. So that kind of says it all. That makes the difference in the success level.
I see.
Do we have time for me to tell you one more little thing? Because
yes,
you and I encountered each other when I came in the middle of your back and forth thing that you had going with Biz Markie about the bells.
Damn, I forgot about the bells.
Sure.
Now that he's no longer with us, can you just release a copy of Peter Piper without the bells?
Well, here's what I wanted to tell you. I did a little round table at the Blue Note with some hip hop guys, and we had a surprise for them because my engineer, David, we had gone out to Iron Mountain to check out my master recordings, the multi-tracks. And
right.
So and got the multi-tracks from those sessions for that album, Take Me to Mardi Gras. And we have an outtake of a different take of Take Me to the Mardi Gras that David made a rough mix and played it for these guys at the round table that nobody had heard before. And it's got the bells on there, but I have the multi-tracks and I could do whatever I want. And when I went to Iron Mountain to check them out to make sure that the multi-tracks were still in good shape, I was able to sit at the console and push a solo button and hear boom, 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 boom.
Wow.
And it's a little bit different groove, and I played the melody differently, different keyboard solo in the middle, and of course it doesn't have any of the other production, any of the strings, all that other stuff, because it was out. but
Wait.
we played it for them last week.
You have a tendency to use a lot of sound effects
Mhm.
on your what's the purpose of that? Because even with Take Me to the Mardi Gras, and even with what I just first mentioned.
Valley of the Shadows.
Sign
Sign of the Times.
No,
Sign of the
Valley of the Shadows, even Valley of the Shadows. Like, what was the purpose in using those like sound effect records on top of the music?
Cinematic. I don't know that we were even that specific about it, but the atmosphere with Take Me to Mardi Gras, we were trying to create the party New Orleans kind of an atmosphere. So that one was pretty clear.
With animal sounds?
No, I don't know. Yeah.
No, it's like this sounds like a bunch of sheep in the background or something. But
It sounds like they were just having fun, is what it sounds
okay.
like a lot on Tappan Zee. They use a lot of sound effects on Tappan Zee, and it's just, you can tell they're just having a blast.
yeah.
That was very much what was going on. Yes, I
Well,
have fond memories of it.
cool. All right,
We're gonna have new sound effects that we'll be able to do on the
let's make it happen.
We're all analog though, so bring your analog thoughts.
Yes, we'll do this. I guess you co-scored one of my all-time favorite films, and I didn't realize it until maybe a year and a half ago during the pandemic that you created the King of Comedy score. So can you talk about working with Scorsese and?
Well, you're crazy. Where do you get all these details? How do you know? You know more information about me than I did.
Dude,
Yeah.
the pandemic happens, and trust me, the pandemic happens. You read all the fine print to keep yourself busy.
Gosh, I mean, I should have done a lot of homework before I did this with you, Questlove. You know so much, and I got to say, my memories of working on that were so vague in my mind now. I'm not sure that I even remember how to talk about it very much.
You just threw it together and just gave it to them.
Well, no, I mean, I know that I was treating it very seriously at the time, but I haven't listened back to it in what, it's been 20, 30, 25 years ago, or at least. It's
40. Same.
Whoops. Okay, well, that gives, and when you reach my age, you know how hard it is to keep retaining a lot of those memories.
Right.
I don't have much of a memory other than the way you described it as a weird film made it a weird assignment for me to make music for it. That's kind of about all I'd be able to say at this point.
No.
But let's do another Zoom. I'll do some homework, listen to it again, and maybe I'll have something more intelligent to say.
No, I watch it like maybe 5 times a year. So for me, like I like when dark films have light music scores because it makes it even darker. So I always wanted to know that. All right.
Contrast, too. It makes it contributes to the power, I think, rather than everything be dark. It's too obvious.
Right. You're right. This is sort of on the same level, but so I used to work in a record store back in high school, and this is right when you and David Sanborn started your collaboration process. I think this is the Double Vision album, but I just got to know this. You guys fade Al Jarreau's voice right when he's about to start scatting like a madman on Since I Fell for You. And I just every time I hear it, like I'm now a collector of Pro Tools and whatnot, like I like hearing the original versions in its dry state and see what happens after the fade. But how long do you have any memory of how long that song goes on after the fade? Because right when the fade goes down, that's when like Al Jarreau just starts scatting out of his mind, and I always wanted to know what happens after that fade.
Well, I can say that I was probably not there in the mix and that choice. I don't remember being there. I didn't produce it. I mean, it was my album, it was my name on it.
Right.
But that fade, usually I would have been very involved and very specifically with the last thing that you want people to hear, and you want it to be hot. You want it to be, and I think the fade works just in the way you described it, because it left you wanting more, and it left it when it's at its most hot. What I would say about that record to you is that I'm very proud of the pre-production arranging and scoring that I did, which is would have been a conventional string orchestra and brass and whatever, but I chose to do it with my home studio equipment, and it's all the strings, all the horns, everything else are me, synthesizers, and many people give me credit that when they hear it, it sounds like a full large orchestra production. But I had a Otari 8-track, and this was in the era when you had the multi-track Studer or whatever in the studio, and then you had to bounce down in order to do the overdub. So I took Bill Schnee, I guess it was, made a pre-mix bouncing down, and all of the basic tracks were on. He gave me 4 tracks or something like that to work with, and I created the woodwinds and French horns and strings and all that were synthesized. And the part that I loved the most was in that exact section you're talking about, where he goes or something like that. And
Right.
I scored it for the French horns going, and the French horns echo that line. And because I had the rough mix that had his vocal already on it, when I was working on my scoring, I was able to actually write the orchestration after the fact to make it sound like Al was responding to the orchestra. So
Right. Okay.
but those French horns were not there when he sang it. So I added the French horns before, so it would make it sound like he was ad-libbing to my orchestration. And if I do
Sort of like Steve Gadd drumming. See, now I realize the
same exact approach. Yeah.
the power of post-production. Now that's the lesson I learned today. No, that was at the time when I was working at that record store. I think Moonlighting, Bruce Willis and Sybil Shepherd's show, very popular show on ABC, had just started using that song. So suddenly that was back in the day when like a show like that could feature a song, and then suddenly everybody's coming in and requesting it. And yeah, when that came out, just the whole world just started asking for, since I, fell for you, that cover. So always
Can I
wanted to
turn
know.
the tables and ask you
Sure.
one question?
Yeah, absolutely.
Since I have the opportunity.
Yeah.
This is a hypothetical only. So since you nor I are kind of session players these days, but if we were in New York session players,
Yes, let's do it.
and if there was a trio date that we were called upon to do, and
You had me at hello.
looking for a bass player, who would you recommend to do a trio date with you on piano and me on drums? I mean the opposite.
Or we could do that. I would actually.
Derek Hodge.
Who?
Derek Hodge.
I would say either Hodge or I would actually go with Pino.
Pino.
Oh, of course, yeah.
I would go with Pino, Derek
Yeah.
Hodge. We can go with Christian McBride.
or McBride, but Pino's,
I like the idea of Pino. I've worked with Pino a little bit many years ago, and Christian McBride I did an album with, so that could be that. But the Pino is more unusual, and since you've worked with them, let's go with that.
Are you committed to a label right now?
Tappan Z. We'll do it on Tappan Z.
See, I was trying to.
Wait, I gotta say, I'm sorry. I have to cut in here because I have my own jazz label here as well. But thanks partially to my love for Tappan Z, and we can go co on that if you're interested. But
I was only joking about Tappan Zee. It's kind of dormant.
Let's bring it back, man. Let's bring it back.
Yeah, I
JMI
was about to
/
say,
Tappan Z.
With Tappan Zee,
I'm signed to JMI for all my jazz stuff, so I got to ask my label president right here.
Yeah.
I'm a free agent, so we
I
can
think
go
we're
ahead and
good for a Bob James Pino Quest
Oh,
album. Yes, we'll sign on for that.
We are absolutely going to do that. And I'm not doing that like fake. You heard it here first, people. No, we're making. I'm telling you, I got so much envy when I saw that clip at Blue Minute, and you know I was working all week. So, but nah, you're a favorite of mine, and you know I thank you for letting us nerd out on you for 2 hours. Yes, we will make this happen. So,
Yay. Okay, I hope that was recorded.
yes, it's absolutely recorded. You can sue me if I renege on this audio contract.
Let's
we're all glad.
let's do it soon because of the age factor. So we don't know how long.
Yes, I don't know if I have much time left. So yes,
Yeah.
I will do it. You will be here forever. Trust me. But once again, wait, Steve, did you ask everything that you absolutely wanted to ask?
No, but
Steve, I'll leave you with the last question, then I'll sign out.
Last question. Whose idea was it to name the first 4 Bob James albums 1, 2, 3, 4? Because we're modeling Ray Angry's catalog after that on our label. But was that preconceived, or did you just do that as it went along?
Definitely Creed Taylor's idea, and the way he explained it to me at that time, because we were very aware of Chicago, the group Chicago had done.
Wow.
Okay.
Talking about it a lot, and the way I remember Creed thinking about it strategically was that, and this was nice that he was thinking that I might have longevity, but if you name it that way, you get to your album 5, and the people are fans. They know that they got 4 that they have to collect. So it's a collectors, the more records you make. And I did have it happen to me that after I got up to 10 or whatever, that the avid fans know what they have to look for. That, ooh, I don't have 8, or I don't have, and I heard him talking about that, but that was what was in his mind.
Oh my gosh.
Just on behalf of Sugar Steve, Laia, Fontigolo, and Unpaid Bill, this is Questlove talking to the great, immortal Bob James, my future collaborator. Yeah, we're going to do this project and up your Grammy count. I'm calling it right now. This is Questlove Supreme, one of the dude. This is Nerd's Paradise right now, and I'm happy. And I'll see you guys on the next go round. Questlove Supreme. See y'all.